Hello and welcome to another episode of God-Sized Stories. This week, my guest is Billy, and you might have heard him on a previous podcast, but you would have just heard him right now actually playing the intro live for this episode instead of me adding it in later. I'm so blessed to have you today, Billy. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
26 years old. I just graduated with my master's in social work, and I'm in a transitioning seasons to my first social work job, and between college and that. So,
well, I've been blessed to know you for a few years now, Billy, in many ways through Bible studies and most of all through friendship. I've always appreciated your musical talents and so glad that you're able to share them with me and our audience with this music right now. But today we're going to talk about something actually other than music. We've had an episode together recently about music, but today is going to be more about you and the inside of you. We've both been through some similar things. Our stories are very different, like everybody. But we've been through some hard times, and you really experienced through a hard time the power of people being there. And today I just wanted you to start at the beginning a little bit about this hard time that you experienced, people helpfulness. But first, where did it start?
I was 20 years old. I was on winter break between semesters at Illinois State, and I was home, and in the middle, right after Christmas, we had a great Christmas. My mom suddenly died. I found her in her room, unresponsive, and it was shocking. It was the hardest. It changed everything for me because I had to process, and at that time I wasn't going to church. I wasn't in the fellowship with other Christians. I wasn't reading the Bible. I was kind of a Christian, kind of a wishy-washy, kind of on my own, kind of private thing. I had to go back to school because I didn't want to. My dad asked me if I wanted to take a semester off. I'm like, what am I going to do? Just sit home. I wanted to focus on something.
Get your mind off.
Right. And I had never experienced anything quite like that before. So I was really in a tough situation going back to school. And at that time, I'd been calling her every day. I had said she lived on campus with me in an apartment for a semester so I could get out of the dorms. And we were very close for her to suddenly go and then try to come back to school. And like I said, I talked to her every day. And, that walk home from class, and you pick up that phone and you go to call somebody who will never pick up the phone again. You will never hear their voice in this life again. And I was only 20 years old, and that was everything you knew was, your mom. That was everything you had ever experienced, known your entire life. And that big chunk, of your life is just absolutely gone forever. And to try and come to grips with the loss of somebody like that in the middle of trying to go through school, that was it.
That it's, as I said earlier, we've had some similar stories. One of the ways you and I first really connected, like we were part of a study together, but it wasn't, you've told me in the past, we didn't really connect until you heard that I went through a similar thing of also losing my mom at a young age and how hard that is. And we've had so many beautiful, God-honoring discussions about that. And one of the themes that always comes out about when we talk about this is the people that surrounded us in that time and just loved on us. Who were some of the people in your life that just surrounded you?
It was a shock because after my mom died, I had an aunt and uncle who lived in Bloomington who I barely knew. My uncle isn't really they're not even related to me technically. He had married my grandmother's sister, so it would be kind of a great uncle, who died at age 55 of breast cancer and had remarried, but was still involved in our family. So I wasn't really related to him or my aunt. I had met them a few times, but they lived in Bloomington. My mom died, and they invited me out for Olive Garden to meet. And I think it was maybe a week or two, maybe just a week after I'd gotten back, and I hadn't eaten much or slept or anything. I mean, just been crying and just really hard grieving. And my family wasn't there. I was in Bloomington away from my dad and everybody. So I went, and I remember I ate so much. I ate so much food, and they paid for it. And then every week after that, they brought me to their house, invited me over for a homemade meal, and then gave me food. They always gave me food to take home, so it was mostly chili. It was mostly chili.
Hey, you gotta love good comfort food of chili.
It was because I didn't cook, and still don't cook. They had brought me to church and realized like kind of where their love was coming from. I also had a grief counselor, which I didn't want. I didn't want a grief counselor. I didn't want to talk about it. But my dad says you have to have a counselor who is a Christian. And she didn't talk about Christ. Neither did my aunt and uncle, besides eventually taking me to church. They didn't talk about heaven. They didn't talk about the Bible. They didn't read me verses. They didn't try to expose me or try to change my faith. They just listened in a way where I felt like I could talk about without, with somebody listening to you and without a rebuttal, without oh, I know what that's like. None of that. Just listening like it's the first time they'd ever heard anything like it. Like my story was, and when they honored it and made it feel like I was really, honored my grief, telling me that, my story was hard. My story was sad. I was going through some things that they were never gone through because they hadn't, because it was my story. It was it's my life. It's my story and my take on it. And they just gave me the space and the love and the attention I needed. I think there are people who came up to me, who mostly talked at me, not even to me. Some people would just talk at me, and that didn't really help. But I understood where they were coming from. Trying to, it's I think, and I've had plenty of friends since. I wouldn't say plenty, but a few where their parents died. One of my friends right in the middle of college, right after my mom died. And to be there for somebody, to know what to say when somebody loses somebody, especially, sometimes it's somebody who's not that close to them, but when it's somebody like your mother, who was your everything. I mean, she was my everything in my life. And all of a sudden I had a big gaping nothing in my life and my purpose and my, I was just very vulnerable, very raw. To spend time with me and allow me to talk and to just be there. There are people who made food, took us out to eat. There was also my family. We all came together for each other, even though we weren't. I couldn't tell you the difference between every single one of my family members before and after my mother died, where we were finally honest about things we felt. At this point, why not? At this point, it was just, we were all feeling the same pain. People who felt my pain sat there in my pain with me and felt it and showed me love through food, through company, through listening, especially because, like I said, I wasn't in a church. Crazy thing was, I didn't like going to church. I didn't have a community. The first community I had was still a couple years later till I met Craig. That was the first community I had of Christians that I, felt like I was comfortable in. And, I feel like as Christians that we have to, put our faith in somebody when they're talk about heaven, talk about where the person went and things are going to be okay, or try to comfort them, or just try and have some sort of, goal when we go to talk to somebody who's going through loss, that once I go in, they're going to feel so much better that I talked to them.
Right.
And no, they might feel exactly the same, because it's not, sometimes it is, but often it's not about what you said. You didn't have to say anything, but it's about the presence of you being there and showing that you really care for somebody in whatever way you can. A lot of people, they're not in the mood to hear comforting words. They don't want to be comforted. What's the word? They want to be, you with them.
Yeah.
Your presence.
Yeah.
They want to
present. Their presence is the present.
Right. They want your presence there. They want you to show them that, it's okay. It's okay to be sad. It's okay to cry. You don't have to stop crying. You don't have to smile. It's okay to be angry. That's one of the grieving process, to be angry. When I expressed I was angry with God, my aunt and uncle, who are strong Christians, never said, don't do that. They never said that. It's okay to be angry, to allow yourself to be angry. Even, I think I struggle with anger. Something about grief is blaming yourself. That's one thing they said, don't blame yourself. That's one thing they told me not to do. That was okay. But eventually, you're going to get mad at God. You're going to get really, because it's not fair. That's the one thing I kept saying. It's not fair. This isn't fair. Because it's not. Nothing. And I've eventually realized there's no fairness. God decides really. And I don't think he bases it on a scale of things have to weigh out perfectly.
Right.
He has his own wisdom and judgment and knowledge of how the world is, and to accept your reality and the way God has made it, and to learn to trust God and not to rush into that trust. Because somebody coming up to say, you got to trust God, or trust everything's going to be okay. They don't know that. You don't know that, and you're not going to believe it. I guarantee you don't feel like in that moment everything's going to be good, because it's not okay. When you lose somebody that close, nothing in the world is okay. Everything is wrong. Nothing's okay. And it's for somebody to sit there, tell you it's okay to not be okay. You are accepted and loved. Your emotions are accepted and loved right then and there. And my aunt and uncle didn't take me to church day one. They didn't invite me to church. Where did they invite me? Olive Garden. They didn't say, hey, come to church. They didn't say that because I didn't want to. They took me to their home. And, gradually they said, would you be okay? They invited me to church, and they didn't.
They built that trust. Yeah,
they built a relationship with me. And there wasn't ever their goal of a secret agenda that they had to secretly use free food to give me to church. But they let God speak through them. And I think the most important thing is they showed that they accepted me the way I was, where I was, how I was, and loved me and they told me how much they thought of me and how, much they thought, like, you really, how proud they were, and made me feel like I was doing well. They made me feel I was doing well. They brought some positivity without arguing with my logic, without arguing with me or disagreeing. They just let me be how I was, and they let Christ mostly come to me. They let Christ open the door through them. Christ was on the other side of the door, and they didn't push me through the door. They didn't point out the door. But once I saw it, they slowly, and I got led to the door through Christ. To let somebody find Christ, but to be there while they're finding Christ on their own is a really big, and I know they were praying for me, of course, absolutely, to find Christ and all this stuff. And I'd say God did it. God was in control that whole experience with them, and they really let God lead the way. And what they showed me was a love I'd never seen. When you show somebody a love, Christ's love through you, they're going to be, you show people love. I think that's the language that Jesus speaks through. And they showed me love, and people are curious once they realize that you really care about them, even though. And I noticed that they were different. I saw how different they were, and my Uncle Vern and my Aunt Doris are my heroes. They were my heroes after that for how they helped me. My whole family did. But for somebody who I said didn't know me, didn't talk to me beforehand, to show me just right out the gate love that I'd never experienced when I needed it, literally came out of nowhere and gave me things I needed so bad, and it gradually let me to understand where that was from and how they could love that way. That's led me to the person I am now.
That's so true, and I connect as well with that statement of, like, I think back to my own mother's passing and her visitation and funeral, and I don't really remember anything that anybody said to me on that day. But I remember very vividly a handful of people that were there. And, like, they weren't there for any other reason than to be there for me, to grieve with me, to hug me if I needed it, and just care for me. And it's like they weren't there to give their ultimate wisdom. They weren't there to give their perfect conclusion on what happened with my mother. They just knew they had to be there because they cared for me, and they wanted to help me get through it however I needed them. And I think this is also something that's very scriptural that we can tie into as well as the story of Job. Now, Job's friends, his three friends, ultimately, when we look at the Bible and we think about his three friends, we think about the terrible things that they do throughout the book, and, like, the things that they encourage him to, like, turn away from God, and they mock God. So it's like, oh, he took all these things, blah, blah, blah. But what we need to do sometimes, we need to focus, actually rewind even earlier into the book, because Job isn't just the end of the book and the middle of the book that we get stuck on so often. Towards the beginning, Job chapter 2, 11 through 13, I'm going to read this, and then I just want to reflect on a few things it says. Now when Job's three friends heard all this evil that had come upon him, they came each from his own place. I won't read the names because I'll butcher them. They made an appointment together to come to show his sympathy and comfort him. And when they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him. And they raised their voices and wept. And they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads towards heaven. And they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him. For they saw that his suffering was very great. Now, these were three friends that originally cared for their friend. They loved Job. They did, and to the point where, like, this was no longer the man they knew. He was in such distress. And for 7 days and 7 nights, they sat and didn't say a word. Like, nobody does that. Like, we can't fathom a place today where no one says a word. They were just there. That was their goal at the start, was to just be there. Audience, I really want you to reflect on that. Think about that. There's always people in your life suffering from one way or another. As a country right now, we are suffering in many ways. And it can be a good opportunity to just sit and be with people and ask them to talk. Just listen. If they don't want to talk, that's fine. Be there with them. Hold them up if they need help. But sometimes our input's not needed. It's just to be there. Love on them. Do whatever they need. That is your job. Your job isn't to necessarily to get them through it. It's not always for you to carry them and say the inspirational thing that's going to change their life. Sometimes it's pull up a chair, sit down, and love them. Audience, thank you so much. Billy, thank you so much for sharing this time with me. Thank you as I've thanked you so many times, and I'm going to continue to thank you so many times for the intro music. And I know in the future I'll probably ask you for another one because
I can't wait.
I like music. I like to change things up. And as always, audience, thank you so much for listening. I couldn't do this without you. Goodbye.